My name is Yulia Sion. I'm a researcher in Haptics, also industry expert in wearable tech. And today I will be hosting this podcast. And today we will be discussing haptics and wearable tech. And my guest today is Keith Kirkland. Keith is a co-founder of WearWorks, a haptic design company that is focusing on delivering experiences that communicates information via haptic technology. Keith is also an adjunct professor at CUNY, and he's teaching emerging media and future tech there. Hi, Keith. Thanks for having this time to chat with me. I'm super excited to talk to you because my research also is closely related to your work, and I'm very much motivated by what you've done so far in haptic tech. So,
how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty great. So firstly, I just want to say thanks for having me. It's you're working in a lab all the time, or a random room, which is post-COVID lab, and like you think you're doing all this stuff that like no one really sees, and so this is the wonderful opportunity for me to meet someone who not only is familiar with my work, but also familiar with other work in the space. I feel like I could ask you more questions than you could ask me, but I guess that's not the way this works from a podcast point of view. So, but really excited to be here.
Thank you. I'm also excited to have you here and be able to talk to you, really. So I'd like to start with a very short question, actually, but I think super important one. Why touch? And what is special about haptic tech and sense of touch?
Yeah, so, I think that for me, my founding story in WearWorks kind of wraps it up in a big way. And, me and my co-founder, we both came into starting the company through very, very different doors. And so my personal door was, I came through engineering previously. I was a fashion designer, mainly handbag and shoe design previously. And then I ended up with a master's degree in industrial design, worked on a project where I was trying to build a suit that would allow a person to download Kung Fu, and the suit would teach them through vibrations, and kind of jumped into this world. And so for me, the reason why touch is because from a personal point of view, I always felt that I understood a lot of information through touch, but it didn't seem to necessarily be the standard. And when I was kind of looking at my personal experience, I started to wonder, wow, with all the research that's been done around touch, I know friends who are blind, deaf, I lose my sense of smell and taste every time I have major allergies, right? You can still live a pretty great life, but, based off of studies done here in orphanages in Romania at the turn of the 19th century, if you're not touched as a baby, you die. And so from my point of view, I see touch as the most important sense, because, if you don't see a photon of light, you don't die, right? And so, and then I started to look at why wasn't touch being used from a point of view of design. And I have my own speculations that are not necessarily research-based. Basically, I think that touch and sex were basically interlinked forever. And most of human history with sex was don't do that, right? So of course, why will we spend time and energy there? But if you look at the spending, based off of senses and research and technology over the last 100 years, if you look around your room, you can see where all the money went. It went to vision. And then after that, much less of it, but still a big amount went to sound, right? And if you look at our visual and sound-based interfaces, 5K video, Dolby 7.1, spatial audio, right? All these advancements, VR, wireless headsets with ridiculous resolution. All these advancements happen because we spent billions and billions of dollars in these areas to figure out what's going on. And so how do we advance touch? We need to research it.
Exactly. And so that's probably connected to my next question, because that's the reason. What is the reason behind of kind of underestimating the touch tech, right? And underlooking. So, and in one of your interviews, I can tell I did a little bit of my research. So a lot of my questions will be based on your kind of direct quotes. And I remember that in one of your talks, you mentioned that you and your coworkers and WearWorks aim to create a new haptic language, right? Because currently haptic language is based either on the arbitrary symbols, right? Like haptic icons, or trying to recreate real touch sensations, which are also kind of far from being realistic in many ways, right? In terms of perception.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is that how do you plan? What is your, I would say, methods that you would like to adopt, maybe from neuroscience, maybe from linguistics, or from any other fields, right? That could make haptic language intuitive, because you were talking about these aspects of being intuitive. And if you're talking about the live touch, right, the real touch, it's super intuitive. That's like the main motivation also for my research, to that haptics, not haptics, but actual touch is super intuitive, and it takes absolutely no cognitive load for us to interpret the intent, the meaning. But when it comes to haptic tech, it becomes difficult, right? So why is that? And how do you plan to bridge that if you're thinking of creating that intuitive language? And feel free to talk about like methods or maybe design aspects, like what type of actuation technology could be potentially useful in that direction, or any other aspects you wish.
Yeah, perfect. And so I think that the language conversation has been, it's been like the holy grail of haptics. It's like build the haptic language, right? Text messages through your skin, right? Can we use Morse code and translate it over? And the thing is like the answer to all that is yes. But there's one thing that we forgot, is that like languages take a ridiculous amount of time to learn.
Exactly.
And so as an example, I started learning Swedish in 2017. I finished my course in Duolingo 4 years later. I can still barely speak. I can't really listen so well, but I can read and write pretty good, right? And that was after 4 years of intensive study. Now,
it's okay for Swedish. I can tell that like that.
But like the thing is that like in the consumer space or designing consumer-based products, none of us as designers have luxury of having a customer for 4 years before they're willing to have to get to a point of usefulness with the device, right? Like we don't have that luxury. And so what we saw was this gap between like I think research shows that somewhere in the space of about like a person can remember like 8 haptic signals relatively intuitively, and then after that like it becomes language learning. And so we were looking at like everyone kind of designing these arbitrary signals and then making them mean things: stop, turn left, go right. And we see it as necessary, and haptic icons are super duper important. But what we also saw was that there was a piece of the conversation that was missing. And the thing that touch is really great at is like, if I were to kiss you or to punch you in the face right now, like you would instantly have a reaction. And that might be positive or negative, or like depending on whether you like being kissed or punched or who's doing the kissing or punching, right? Like context plays a very heavy role in it, but you would have an immediate reaction, right? And so from the point of view of, like the limitation on sound is that it's very linear. Like you have to wait until the end of my sentence to understand what I might be talking about, usually, right? Like vision is kind of like it's two-dimensional and it's time-based, but it's also really slow for processing, right? It's like, like how many times is like, I don't know, someone been on a dating app and swiped left on a person that they actually liked because, their fingers were moving and their eyes faster than their eyes could recognize, right? And so, but with touch, you have this ability of like almost instant communication and non-linearity at the same time.
And how do you think can we create that? How can we achieve that? Do you think there is a potential for that, given current knowledge, limitations of our perception, and also technology that we have so far?
Yeah, and I think that like a big part of it is like a simplification. And so when I initially gave my TED talk, I was in the space of haptics as a language, like let's build a language, but then like in my research, in my personal research, I read books about linguistics. I read like the history of human language. I read all these things that were like, what mechanisms from language learning can we bring into the creation of haptic language? And at the same time, haptics is ridiculously closely related to sound, like it's like infrared light versus visible light, right? It's just the same stuff, just like a different range of spectrum. And so we've also been looking at what sound companies have been doing. Like how did the pioneers of sound first quantify what a sound was and how loud a sound was, and, like in those pieces of technology. So I think that kind of like going directly to it, like there is space to do that right now. What we really need is we need research. And the challenge with that is that right now, haptic devices, one, they're not so consistent and common. So like what Apple uses in their phone is different than what Samsung uses, which is different than what Fitbit uses, which is different than what—
You mean in terms of actuation, right?
Exactly. So, it's like every company is making or putting in different speakers, but we're trying to create, we're trying to create a world where I feel something and you feel the same thing on your device, even though your device might not necessarily have the same haptic actuator technology as my device. Right? How do we build consistency across platforms? Now, we had that issue with screens back in the day, right? And then, Adobe came out and, some other companies, and they came together and they built ways to color correct screens, right? Ways to adjust per device based off of the output. So what we need is we really need some systems in place that allow us to understand that what I'm feeling is actually what you're feeling, because right now I have no way of knowing your perception of touch, what you feel, or if the actuation is actually delivering the exact same experience.
So if I understand correctly, so first you started researching haptic language from the perspective of linguistics, right? Which is closely related to creating haptic icons, right? It's arbitrary symbols. But they are taking lots of cognitive load from people, right? They're not as intuitive and all that. So now we need to find another method, a way to create more intuitive touch, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
So the question is how, and you mentioned an interesting idea of, I assume, adopting certain things from sound, right? Because it's essentially the same. And actually, it's related also to some works that I've done so far. And I see that certain aspects, let's say, of engineering parameters like frequency and amplitude, they are related to, you can translate them. The effect could be translated from sound to the vibration, right? Or what other ways could be, in addition to adapting, let's say, music parameters to vibration, maybe other ways?
Yeah, and so
have you thought about other ways of making this language more intuitive? If you thought,
yeah, definitely. Because it was a conundrum. Because at the end of the day, haptics won't have the opportunity to proliferate as far as we would like them to if the cognitive load for learning haptics is too much work. And so what we drew on is we actually drew on another linguistic element, metaphor, and there became a powerful piece in that, like that idea of a kiss or a punch in the face. Can you
tell more about metaphor? What do you mean by that, and how do you create it?
Yeah, so the way we look at haptics is, instead of looking at it as letters and words, we look at it as like metaphors and context. And so if you imagine, for example, in my TED talk, I talked about this idea of stop, right? If I was given the task of designing the haptic for stop, what would I do? Where would I start? Right now, I could just design any ramp, but right. And over time, you'll learn that means stop if you like my product enough to want to learn that, right? And it's distinctive enough from everything else. But how do I make you feel like you should stop, even if you've never felt the haptic before? Right?
So how?
and the thing is that we all have a tactile memory. Most of us can recire the whoopings we got from our moms as little kids, with sticks on trees or whatever, however your parents did it, right? Those tactile memories are real. Most of us have the memory of being in a car and having that car stop suddenly, right? Or getting your bag caught on a door and that motion of that jerk of, you thought you could move, but some force said that you can't. Pull back on it, right?
But isn't it true that haptic memory is kind of short also? We can't really recreate it in our memories until we really feel it?
Yeah, I mean, you can't create it in a sense of oh, I saw this picture, let me draw this picture the exact way I saw it. But they're big. Like if I said, what does it feel like to be stopped? You're like, okay, if I seatbelt in a car stops suddenly, or handbag on a door handle, gets caught in door, right? Or mom grabs your wrist because you were running across the street as a kid, and like we all have that experience of the jerk back.
Exactly.
So if we wanted to design stop, if I wanted to design stop, where I would start is like, how do I create a jerk that resonates in some way with all of the experiences that you've had in life of like kind of being stopped, like physically from your body. And then I would try to translate that into a haptic experience in some abstract format, like I wouldn't try to replicate the exact feeling of pulling on a shoulder, right? And right now in the haptic space, we have lots of people who are doing, like they're trying to recreate haptic sensations from reality as in a virtual space as if they were real. That's not what we're doing. We're like the cubist of haptics, like we abstract haptics and then pull out the most dominant elements, repeat them, and define meaning around them.
All right. So this is
exactly perfectly as a natural light. We're taking the elements about the haptic experience and amplifying and modifying them to make an intuitive experience that's easier to understand.
All right. So if I want to dig deeper, if you don't mind, because it's super interesting, and it's not only interesting, it's a critical topic in haptics, because I think this is what's kind of stops us from developing it further, right? This intuitiveness and ease of use, right? Like implicit, actually, communication for haptics. That's what we need to achieve. And so, as I see you are doing something in between of recreating a real touch sensations, like in VR, right? Or something in between that and the symbols, right? The haptic icons. Am I correct? So it is something in between.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? It might not be necessarily as much in between as it might be like borrowing from both elements as the need arises. So maybe it's a bit more hybrid than in between, but the idea is that if we found the challenge there's a bigger challenge with haptics actually than the language part. The bigger challenge is that, like Beyonce could roll out of bed right now, drop a song, sell 1 million copies by the end of the night, because we all have speakers and the 21st century equivalent of the phonograph, which is music streaming, right? But if there were no speakers, Beyonce would have to come to every single person and sing individually to get their $15 for the album, right? Like not scalable. And if you look at movement, a lot of it is based in a space where it's like, it doesn't scale as well. And so what we decided to do, and a lot of the work that we were doing, is when we started the Wayband, we first wanted to build a device that would allow researchers, gamers, developers, anyone, an easy way to build, try, and create haptic experiences. Like that was our dream, was this ubiquitous haptic device that would allow a person to do anything they want with it. And once you have speakers, guess what? You can create music because everyone has now speakers to listen to. So we were trying to be the haptic version of AirPods, essentially, when we started, agnostic to whatever haptic signals may be coming for whatever reason. But then we realized something really important, that no one knew what the word haptic meant. It's not a common word in the English lexicon or in most lexicons, for example. And so every single person, even my friends who are super word nerds, the kind of guys that like will like hag you, like, oh, you said that word wrong, like, oh, quiet, like I was like, yo, you know what haptic means? He was like, never heard of it. And I was like, wow, there's no hope, like for like the lay person. And like, we're building a whole thing where you have to understand what haptics are to know what to do with. And so we ran into an immediate challenge where we're like, wait, no one's going to know what to do with this because no one knows what this word means. The proliferation hasn't gotten there yet. So like, what do we do in the meantime? And so we decided like, well, you know what? When Apple first came out, they built like, these mobile phones that had no buttons, right? And people probably didn't really know what to do with them. So they built the first apps. They built iMessenger, they built Safari phone.
Can I ask a question about Wayband, actually, because you mentioned, and I want to get there too. So if you could tell me, just introduce Wayband for our audience, and then tell me a little bit more, if you can, about the design process behind Wayband, right? So, so you will tell what it does, right? But then if you could touch upon how did you design the specific haptic, whether it's an icon or was it something else, or maybe it was a creating of a real touch, and why did you decide on that, right? So basically, how did you create that haptic language within Wayband, and how did you make the decision on that? And any other, design process aspect you could share with us.
No, that's great. So WearWorks is a haptic platform company. And that's where that idea of kind of like building the ubiquitous haptic devices that people can build from. And our first product is Wayband, which is a haptic navigation app that pairs with an optional wristband that gently guides users to an end destination.
That's yours? That's the one that you have right now?
Yeah, this is the Wayband.
Oh, cool.
And so it navigates you to your end destination using only vibrations without the need for any visual or audio feedback. And back in 2017, we used this technology to help the first person who was blind run 15 miles of the New York City Marathon without needing a sighted guide. And so the way it works, thank you so much. The way it works is when you're in the right way, you kind of feel nothing, you don't feel anything at all. So if you're facing the right way, you feel nothing, right? You swivel to the left about 20 or 30 degrees or right, and you'll get a tiny vibration. We call this the haptic corridor. Actually, our customers called it the haptic corridor because what they do is they swing the phone or the bin like they swing the cane from left to right. They feel the edge of the vibration here. They feel the edge of the vibration here, and they're moving along. And they feel like there's a hallway that the Wayband is keeping them inside of.
So can I ask a question? So they feel vibration on the side of kind of, let's say if I'm going to the right and it's the wrong direction to the right, so I feel the vibration from my right side to push me towards left?
No,
or it vibrates always in the same location on the band.
Exactly. We actually, like the haptic spatial problem, most people, that's what they did, was that they said, hey, I need you to go left, I'm gonna put a haptic on the left side. I need you to go right, I'm gonna put a haptic on the right side. But also, so it's like the challenges that creates is that like if the locations are too close on the skin, it's really hard to tell, especially at the wrist, because there's a lot of bone and vibration. So it's hard to tell whether this part of your wrist or this part of your wrist. I mean, you can tell left and right, but like telling like from a 90-degree angle, vibration can be
Plus,
a bit
it could be
challenge.
confusing, right? Let's say if it vibrates from the right, maybe it means I have to go further to the right.
Exactly.
I'm not being pushed to the left, so it's also confusing. It could be.
So what we did is we used a single actuator, and what we did is we didn't design left or right. We designed a 360-degree experience. We designed correct and incorrect, and then we designed correct and varying degrees of incorrect. So when you're facing 0, you feel nothing. Up to 30 degrees, you feel the tiniest vibration we can give you. That vibration will scale linearly in volume the wronger you get until you're 180 degrees the wrong way. And at that point, we give you the loudest vibration that your device can. So there's a linear scale, like a volume. It's like turning down the volume on a stereo. You get to the right way, there's no sound. And the metaphor that we took from the haptic, I mean, you can take the haptic corridor, that was the metaphor that was created by our users, but the metaphor that we took was like kind of like follow the light, but in the light, there's space, there's quiet, there's silence. Right. So we just took the metaphor of follow the light and then turned it into a haptic experience. And so now we know where you are. We know the next intersection that you need to go to. In most places, that's a straight line. So we know that you need to get there. And when you get there, we give you a haptic that then says buzz, 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 your phone is ringing. And at that moment, we give you a new direction to go into.
I see. So it's a vibrotactile feedback, correct? So
exactly. And it's constant haptic feedback. So they get the feedback whenever they pull their arm up and they swing to the left or swing to the right. They get the feedback instantaneously at every given moment that they're moving through. And we also design haptics to be no vibration, mainly because vibrations are pretty annoying if they're consistent.
Exactly. That's and also habituation.
and battery power, like, which was the biggest part of the issue, is that we didn't want to drain the devices or make unnecessary battery or weight sacrifices so that the device can feel as light and as natural as possible.
And how did you decide on the levels of intensities? Let's say like these ranges, like the lowest versus middle and highest.
Yeah, I mean, we did a lot of testing on ourselves. We did a lot of testing with users, because the thing is that, like, and then the other part that's super important is that, like, touch changes dramatically based off of the body part that you're applying touch information to.
Exactly.
And, like, anyone who's in haptics knows that, but anyone who's not might not be so clear. So if I put a haptic motor on my back at this strength, like, yeah, you could feel it, but, like, you wouldn't be able to discern the information that you can discern at the wrist, because the wrist, the receptors fire, they're more sensitive, they fire more easily, like, and they're closer together. And so that creates a problem from the point of view of where you design the haptic piece and where you want to put it at. The other thing is that, like, there are conditions, like, because a lot of people in our community have disabilities. We work a lot with blind and visually impaired, with people who are deafblind, with people who are deaf, with wheelchair users, power and manual. We work with people in the neurodivergent community, autism, right? And so everyone has a very different sensation of touch, even at the same vibration levels delivered from the device. Like, this vibration can be really annoying to you and loud to you, and it can be, like, imperceptible to me. And it's like, so a lot of it is, like, a lot of research. Like, if you have diabetic retinopathy, you lose sensation of touch. So it's like, as you start to kind of get older, add disabilities onto this, you start to get a flavor for how varied our touch experience is. And I would go to say, it's like, like, I can't tell if the green that you see in my shirt is the green that I see when I wear my shirt.
Correct.
But at least we have things like Pantone to, like, be able to color compare and reference. Like, we have nothing like that in haptics, really. That
Correct.
is like,
so it means that there is no way to create universal haptic language, right? Or universal haptic communication, or it's about the levels of intensity that we need to be able to change.
Yeah, so I think that, like, the universality, I mean, I don't think it's possible to create a universal anything, like, because, one size fits all means that it fits most people pretty terribly, right? Like,
well, yeah, sure. Some averages, let's say. I want to, have a haptic experience of waterfall. It's kind of, across the population, waterfall means one thing, right? For all.
Exactly.
But waterfalls could change, one perceived waterfall as being bigger or smaller, but as a concept itself, it's still a waterfall.
Exactly.
Do you think can you do something like this using haptics?
Yeah, I mean, imagine how hard it was to do this with wine. Like, hey, it's sweet, but, like, imagine how difficult the first winemakers had to, like, hey, what's the difference between your wine and this wine? Well, my wine is fruitier, bolder, a little bit dirtier, bitter, like, but it's like that whole vocabulary of, like, it's a whole vocabulary.
So
like,
which is also missing, right, in haptic kind of industry, right? Like,
exactly.
We are trying to create it. It's kind of there, but it's not universal yet. So
exactly, and like, and the thing is that, like, like, universality is like, you can't. I mean, you can attempt to make universal standards, of course, and have those accepted, but at the end of the day, like, people. The reason that standards become universal is, I mean, outside of, like, kind of like being, like, deeply dictated from the top, that is because they're valuable and they're very useful, right? And I think that, like, as a haptic community, like, I mean, haptics has been around for hundreds of years, but, like, as a community, like, we really are just at the beginning of exploring what's possible for touch. Like, I went to design school. I took entire classes on how the eye processes color information, and how if you put this color next to this color, and if you put this color next to this color, you're going to create a totally different emotional response based off of the color values and combinations. Where's that for touch? Like, where's my haptic design education?
I like you mentioned about emotions because it's related to my next question. And so I'm going to use your quote here. So let me read it. So in one of the interviews you mentioned, your mission is to become the boss of touch. while developing products that actually shift with people's lives and in a meaningful way. That's what you said. So now, can you please share a couple of exemplary scenarios where haptics can change people's lives in kind of meaningful way, right?
Yeah.
And let me just give you an example from my motivations in terms of doing research in haptics is that, first of all, we already established that sense of touch plays a humongous role in our lives, right? Without touch, we are nothing, basically. But it also brings a lot of affective information, right? So touch is basically communication of emotion for me in many ways, right? And I wonder, hypothetical in future, can we have affective communication using haptics, right? Can we regulate our emotions using haptic tech, right?
Yeah.
As if we had an arm next to us, a loving arm that makes us feel better, or otherwise maybe more energetic, or can we communicate information which is totally different in a sense? Can I communicate Starry Night using haptics? Things like that. So just hypothetical scenarios and too hypothetical, less hypothetical. Share your thoughts about that, please.
Yeah. And so, like, I think that from the opening, yes, I think that if you look at music right now, most musicians don't make music with a visual or taste or smell-based component while they're composing, right? Like most artists aren't thinking of what the soundtrack for their painting is going to be, right? But if you're a haptic designer, you're basically constantly designing in an audio visual dominant haptic subordinate world. Like it's like, hey, your controller rumbles, but then you see the screen and you roll off the ground and then the sounds and then you get the rumble. And it's not like haptics is always like a supplement to audio addition and vision. And the world that I'm really excited about is that what happens when haptics has a space like music and art to be divorced completely from the relationship to the other senses.
Exactly. So yes, please tell me more.
So, so one of the things that a lot of work needs to be done. And I think this is where, from my point of view, like where the work that we're coming in at is that by making the waveband, we make a haptic thing that navigates and that helps people in a really meaningful way. But also, we make a platform that then researchers and developers who have no interest in like navigation can just grab a waveband, encode it, and program it to do and respond to anything that they want. And I think that like once a tool is placed into the world, into the haptic kingdom, that like anybody can just pick up,
like it's open source, right?
Exactly. It's like being able to pick up. It's like Minecraft, right? Like you can build. Yeah, you can build dumb things, or you can build like the Eiffel Tower and at scale, right? So it's like like people have gotten so creative with what can be done, and we want to see what happens when we unleash this power to the world and say like, hey, like we have game designers who want to design non-visual and non-audio games, right? We have like people in the sports space that want to like put wavebands on soccer players' legs so that they don't throw out their knees while running, measuring forces and giving them haptic feedback along the way. So a lot of the stuff that we're doing right now and in this first stage, I think it's going to be a lot of that is that like we're finding new ways of giving people information directly through the skin instead of through the eyes and the ears as the dominant, delivery channel.
So your way is to basically isolating haptics and making it like as a central modality for communication. That's one way, right?
Yeah. And I don't think it's necessary because, at the end of the day, like nothing works in isolation. And I'm a haptic purist. I remember, we went into, our team talked about adding audio to the app. And I was like, that defeats the whole point. I was really against it, but then I was like, wait, our users are blind. They might want the audio too. This isn't about my personal journey to make touch like equivalent to sight and sound in the design community, which that's my personal journey.
And just any like ideas, dreams in terms of like futuristic scenarios, or not completely futuristic, realistically future scenarios where haptics could be used.
And so like So we're seeing lots of applications. Like, so one, you know, the medical space is pretty renowned for haptics already. I mean, after the
Right.
video game and sex toy industry, they have kind of become like a major proponent of haptics.
Oh,
But a lot of that,
accessibility, right?
exactly, accessibility. There's the Da Vinci robots and robotic surgeries, and that feedback that's necessary for a surgeon to understand what it is that they're doing, right? Um, so the medical spaces, but we're also looking at like sound and touch are so related, right? But we already know scientifically proven that there are sound, that make you calm down, right? And that sounds that like amp you up or agitate you. Touch is exactly the same thing in a different frequency range. Theoretically speaking, all those concepts of sound should translate over. And so what we're looking at is like what happens when our haptic corridor not only can vibrate to let you know you're going the wrong way, but the vibrations it gives you reduce cortisol levels so that people who are blind or visually impaired who have anxiety while being out in the space actually get a therapeutic use while navigating. Right. And so we see that the therapeutic opportunities in haptics are really deeply profound. But beyond that, because that a lot of that is in the consumer space, and like what are we looking to like monetize in the next 4 to 5 years. But when I think about like what's possible beyond monetization, like I think that the biggest possibility is that the skin is an untapped channel that we don't know the limit to from a point of view of communication and bandwidth. And I think
opportunities are endless, basically. That's what you're
I don't think they're endless, but I think that like we need a lot of people out there doing research to figure out where the end is. Like we know the limit of vision and sound super clearly because we've done so much research on it.
I'm curious about this aspect of haptics in terms of evoking memories. Like, for example, dementia or Alzheimer, or anyone would like to have such like symbolic object or any object tangible, right? With haptic feedback, can haptic actually help to evoke some forgotten memories or make them brighter or something like that?
Yeah, and the thing is that like smell does that super well.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
Like how many times I like open the closet, I'm like, wow, like, and all of a sudden I'm 10 years old and I'm at my great grandma's closet and I smell mothballs and I'm like, oh, this smells like my great grandma's closet. And I haven't thought about that closet at all until this moment, so smell has that instant access. I don't know if touch has it. I think it does.
The real touch has actually, I checked. So it should be with haptics similar. You just need to figure out how to do that.
Exactly. And there's all this work because like I have a friend who's studying right now like how trauma develops and lives in the body and manifests itself in different ways. And so I think that like the body's physical representation in connection to like how we feel about ourselves or what's going on in our mental space, like we know that connection is there. We don't understand it completely yet. And I think that like once we understand really like how like the touch part of that system works, I think we're going to open up like a completely different opportunity, to be able to essentially, I don't know, just like to ask more interesting questions than we've been able to and actually get them answered. And right now, like if you wanted to try some haptic stuff, right? First, you got to know hardware. Then you got to know firmware.
Correct.
Then you got to know software. Then you need to know fashion to make it wearable so it doesn't break, right? And that's all before you can design a haptic anything.
You also need to know neuroscience, psychophysics.
Exactly. The neuroscience and and how the body understands and receptors process touch information. So it's like my dream is that like when we're done this work, like your daughter is going to be able to go to college and study haptic design for a 4-year degree, the same way she can study graphic design right now, culinary arts, or music theory.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Well, I think I have more questions, but I think we should wrap up. And I think I asked all my main questions, and I really appreciate your time. So thank you, Keith, for your time, really. And I wish you, many more innovations and to really become that boss of haptics. And I hope to see you.